The Pacific Ocean in the autumn of 1942 was not just a body of water, it was a graveyard. For months, the waters around Guadalcanal had swallowed men, steel, and machines in such massive quantities that the sailors began calling it Iron Baton Sound. The United States Marines were clinging to a thin, bloody perimeter on the island, holding a crude dirt airstrip known as Henderson Field. By day, American aircraft ruled the skies, forcing the Imperial Japanese Navy to stay clear. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, the night belonged exclusively to the Japanese. It was during these dark hours that the Tokyo Express came alive. Fast destroyers and heavy cruisers of the Imperial Navy would sprint down the slot, a narrow naval corridor through the Solomon Islands, to drop off fresh troops, heavy artillery, and provisions, before turning their massive guns on the Marines to shell them into submission. The United States Navy had tried to stop them before, but the results had been catastrophic. At the Battle of Savo Island, just 2 months earlier, the Japanese had crept into the Sound undetected, using their unmatched mastery of night optics and long-lance torpedoes to butcher for Allied cruisers in less than 30 minutes. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in American military history. The U.S. Navy was terrified of the dark. They knew that if they could not find a way to contest the night, Guadalcanal would fall, and the entire Pacific campaign would stall. But on the night of October 11th, 1942, things were about to change. A new man had been given the impossible task of breaking the Japanese curse of night warfare. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, commanding Task Force 64, was not a man who believed in luck. He believed in rigorous, relentless preparation. For 3 weeks, Scott had drilled his crews until they were drop-dead, exhausted. He kept his ships at battle stations from dusk until dawn, forcing his lookouts, gunners, and radar operators to acclimate to the pitch-black tropical environment. Scott's force was built around 4 cruisers, the heavy cruisers San Francisco and Salt Lake City, and the light cruisers Boise and Helenas, courted by 5 destroyers. Scott knew that the Japanese had a massive advantage in visual night optics. Their lookouts used specially designed, high-powered binoculars and were trained to see silhouettes in the dark from miles away. To counter this, the Americans had a secret weapon that was about to revolutionize naval warfare: radar. Specifically, the new SG surface search radar. While Scott's flagship, the San Francisco, was unfortunately equipped with the older, less reliable SC radar. Ships like the Helena and the Boise carried the cutting-edge SG radar, which could paint a clear, digital picture of the sea, even in total, suffocating darkness. As Task Force 64 steamed towards Cape Esperance, the northernmost tip of Guadalcanal, the tension on board was thick enough to cut with a knife. The men knew they were sailing into the jaws of the dragon. Meanwhile, racing down the slot at over 26 knots was a powerful Japanese bombardment force, commanded by Rear Admiral Norman Gotō. Gotō was a veteran, aggressive commander, and his mission tonight was critical. He commanded 3 heavy cruisers, his flagship Aoba, followed by the Fudutaka and the Kinagasu, alongside 2 destroyers, the Fubuki and the Hatsuyuki. Their goal was simple but devastating: steam directly to Lunja Point and unleash a catastrophic bombardment on Henderson Field to destroy the American aircraft before a massive troop convoy, led by Rear Admiral Gotō, could land reinforcements nearby. Gotō was completely unaware that an American fleet was in the area. In fact, Japanese intelligence had assured him that the U.S. Navy was demoralized and retreating from the waters of Guadalcanal. Gotō's ships did not possess radar. He relied entirely on his elite lookouts and the absolute conviction that no American commander would dare to challenge the Imperial Navy in a night action. This supreme confidence, bordering on deadly arrogance, would be the fatal flaw that evening. As the two fleets closed the distance at a combined speed of nearly 50 miles per hour, they were on a direct collision course in the blind darkness at 2200 hours. Scott ordered his cruisers to launch their floatplanes for reconnaissance. It was a standard procedure, but tonight it went horribly wrong. As the USS Salt Lake City launched her plane, the volatile aviation fuel caught fire, creating a massive, brilliant flare of light that illuminated the American fleet for miles around. Scott was horrified. He was certain that the Japanese had seen the flash and that the element of surprise was lost. He immediately ordered his ships into a tight battle line with 3 destroyers, the Duncan and the Laugh filling the column, followed by the 4 cruisers, and wrapped up by the remaining 2 destroyers, the Buchanan and the McCulloch. What Scott did not know was that Gotō's fleet had missed the flash due to a sudden tropical squall that masked the horizon. Luck was shifting, but so was confusion. By 2300 hours, Scott reached the designated turning point near Savo Island, but his scouts had reported nothing. Believing the enemy might have bypassed him, Scott decided to reverse his course. He ordered a 180-degree column turned to the left. This complex maneuver, executed in pitch darkness, became a recipe for absolute chaos. The turn disrupted the rigid American formation. The 3 Vanguard destroyers, led by Captain Robert Tobin on the Fahrenheit, did not receive the turn order simultaneously. While the heavy cruisers began to pivot, the destroyers found themselves out of position, scrambling up the starboard side of the cruiser line to regain their lead. It was precisely at this moment of intense tactical vulnerability, at 2332 hours, that the SG radar on the USS Helena lit up. 5 distinct green blips appeared on the screen, bearing down on the American line from 27,000 yards away. The Japanese were coming. The Helena immediately notified Admiral Scott over the talk-between-ships radio circuit. But Scott had a massive problem. Because his own flagship lacked the advanced SG radar, his screens showed nothing. Furthermore, he knew his 3 lead destroyers were out of position and wandering in the dark. Scott became paralyzed by a terrifying thought. Were these radar contacts the enemy, or were they his own misplaced destroyers? As the seconds ticked away, the distance between the 2 forces collapsed with terrifying speed. On board the Japanese flagship Aoba, lookouts suddenly spotted black shapes on the horizon. Dead ahead, just 11,000 yards away. They reported the sightings to Admiral Gotō, but Gotō refused to believe it. He was convinced that the ships ahead were part of Admiral Giemma's friendly supply convoy, which he believed had gotten ahead of schedule. To avoid a friendly fire incident, Gotō ordered his signalman to climb onto the superstructure and flash a brilliant visual identification signal into the dark. "I am Aoba. Identify yourself." The Japanese were literally flashing a light at an invisible enemy, broadcasting their exact position to the waiting American gunners. On board the USS Helena, Captain Gilbert Hoover could see the Japanese ships perfectly through his radar-guided fire control computers. The target was close, completely exposed, and moving horizontally across the American line. Scott had inadvertently stumbled into the ultimate holy grail of naval tactics. He had crossed the enemy's T. His entire fleet could fire their full broadsides, while the Japanese could only fire their forward-facing turrets. Captain Hoover could not wait any longer. He radioed Scott, asking for permission to open fire using the standard procedure. Request permission to internal communications. Scott, still confused about his destroyers, replied with a brief, "Roger." But Roger did not mean yes in the way Scott intended. Scott meant message received. I am evaluating. To Captain Hoover, however, it meant permission granted. At 2346 hours, the Helena's 15 6-inch guns erupted in a blinding flash of orange fire. Within a split second, the Boise, the Salt Lake City, and the San Francisco followed suit. The night erupted into an absolute inferno of screaming steel. The Battle of Cape Esperance had begun, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was about to receive the shock of a lifetime. The first salvo from the American cruisers hit the Japanese flagship Aoba with devastating, surgical precision. Admiral Gotō and his crew were completely paralyzed with shock. They weren't just caught off guard. They were mentally unprepared for combat. As the first wall of 8-inch and 6-inch high-explosive shells slammed into the Aoba's superstructure, the bridge turned into a slaughterhouse of flying steel, shattering glass, and burning paint. The primary fire control systems were instantly vaporized. The ship's main communications network was severed, and 2 of her massive main gun turrets were twisted into useless heaps of burning wreckage. Admiral Gotō himself was mortally wounded in the opening seconds, his legs shattered by shell fragments. As he lay dying on the bloody deck of his ruined bridge, surrounded by screaming men and choking black smoke, he was still locked in total disbelief. According to Japanese survivors, his final bitter words were "bakaja," a fierce Japanese insult meaning idiots or dumbasses. Even in his final breath, Gotō believed that his own friendly supply ships had betrayed him and were the ones blowing his fleet to pieces, while the Japanese fleet was being chewed to pieces. Absolute panic struck the American command. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, watching the ferocious barrage from the bridge of the San Francisco, was still consumed by the terrifying fear that he was killing his own men. His radio was buzzing with frantic reports that the American destroyers Fahrenholt and Duncan were missing from the column. Lookouts reported seeing a small destroyer taking heavy fire right in the middle of the kill zone. Terrified of a catastrophic friendly fire disaster, Scott picked up the microphone at 2347 hours and issued a frantic fleet-wide order: cease firing. Cease firing all ships. But on ships like the Helena and the Boise, the captains knew with absolute certainty that their radar-guided guns were locked onto enemy hulls. The firing slackened for a few agonizing moments, but some captains simply ignored the order or failed to hear it over the deafening roar of their own batteries. Captain Moran of the Boise radioed back, "We are locked onto an enemy heavy cruiser. Request permission to resume." Realizing the radar data was undeniable, Scott rescinded his order after 2 long minutes. The reprieve for the Japanese was over, and the American guns opened up once more with renewed, merciless fury during those 2 minutes of American hesitation. The Japanese fleet tried desperately to react, but they were trapped in a classic tactical ambush. The Japanese destroyer, Fubuki, displaying immense courage, charged directly toward the American line to draw fire away from the crippled Aoba. It was a suicide run. The San Francisco and the Salt Lake City turned their full, devastating secondary batteries on the incoming destroyer. At a range of less than 5,000 yards, American shells walked right across the Fubuki's deck, detonating her ammunition magazines. The ship blew apart in a spectacular, towering column of white-hot flame, sinking into the dark waters of Iron Biddam Sound within minutes, leaving only a handful of survivors clinging to oil-slicked debris. Meanwhile, the heavy cruiser Furutaka tried to turn to follow the fleeing Aoba, but she was trapped. Her turn brought her directly into the path of the American cruiser line. The USS Helena's rapid-fire 6-inch guns turned the Furutaka into a floating furnace. A shell punctured her torpedo tubes, igniting her highly volatile Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes. The resulting explosion ripped open the cruiser's hull, flooding her engine rooms and sealing her doom. Yet the Imperial Japanese Navy was never an enemy to be underestimated. While the Aoba and the Furutaka were being systematically destroyed, the third Japanese heavy cruiser, the Kinugasa, commanded by Captain Masaosawa, showed why the Japanese were feared in night battles. The Kinugasa had turned away from the initial ambush, escaping the concentrated American radar tracking, slipping into the dark shadows of Savo Island. She trained her powerful 8-inch guns onto the flashing silhouettes of the American ships. Her primary target was the light cruiser USS Boise, whose rapid, continuous firing made her look like a glowing neon sign in the dark. At midnight, the Kinugasa's gunners found their mark. A devastating 8-inch armor-piercing shell from the Kinugasa smashed directly through the Boise's unarmored hull, penetrating deep into her forward main ammunition magazine handling room. The explosion was catastrophic. A roaring wall of fire shot through the forward part of the ship, instantly killing over 100 men in the gun crews and magazines. The blast was so violent that water rushed into the open hull, which ironically saved the ship from a total magazine detonation by instantly drowning the raging fires. The boys pulled out of the line, burning fiercely, her forward turrets silenced, listing heavily to port. Seeing his fleet losing cohesion and his ships taking heavy damage, and with the Japanese main force now scattered and retreating north, Admiral Scott knew he had pushed his luck far enough in the dark. At 0020 hours, he ordered Task Force 64 to break off the pursuit and retire toward the south. The chaotic gunfire ceased, and a heavy, eerie silence once again settled over the smoke-choked waters of Cape Esperance. As the tropical sun rose on the morning of October 12th, the true scale of the violence became visible. The Battle of Cape Esperance was over, and the ledger of death was written in blood. The Japanese had lost the heavy cruiser Furutaka and the destroyer Fubuki during the night action. The following morning, American aircraft from Henderson Field hunted down and sank 2 more Japanese destroyers, the Natsugumo and the Murakumo, which had stayed behind to rescue survivors. The Japanese flagship Aoba was a burned-out, floating wreck carrying over 80 dead crew members back to her base. On the American side, the destroyer USS Duncan lay at the bottom of the sea, completely destroyed by friendly and enemy fire, while the Boise and the Fahrenheit were severely damaged. Over 160 American sailors and nearly 500 Japanese sailors had lost their lives in a matter of hours. Historically, the Battle of Cape Esperance was a crucial psychological breakthrough for the United States Navy. For the first time in the war, an American fleet had met the legendary night fighters of the Imperial Japanese Navy in pitch darkness and had beaten them at their own game. It shattered the myth of Japanese night invincibility and provided a massive, sorely needed boost to Allied morale across the entire Pacific theater. Yet it was a victory born out of pure chaos, technological transition, and fortunate mistakes. Admiral Scott had won not because his tactics were flawless, but because radar had given him a split-second window of supremacy that the Japanese could not see coming. The battle taught the Americans that radar was the future of naval warfare, but it also gave them a dangerous, false sense of security. They believed they had fully mastered night combat, a tragic misconception that would lead to even bloodier, more horrific naval clashes in the waters around Guadalcanal just 1 month later. But on that wild night off Cape Esperance, the U.S. Navy proved to the world that they were no longer afraid of the dark, changing the course of the Pacific War forever.